Hello YouTube, DrakeyC here. Last night a whole bunch of new screenshots for the Pixel Remasters of the first 6 Final Fantasy games came out, and I am very excited because there was actually a lot of information that you can get from analyzing these screenshots, and 2 details in particular that really make me question what these remakes are going to be. So right off the bat, we have Cornelia on the world map of Final Fantasy 1, and you can tell that these are widescreen, which obviously is a big deal, but you can also tell here that there are some Game Boy Advance assets seemingly being used. The town sprites look very similar, but they're not quite exactly the same, and the force isn't exactly the same either. We have another screenshot of the battle with Garland, and here you can tell that yes, it is seemingly based on his Game Boy Advance sprite, but it's not exact. The lining of his cape is a little different. There's some spot where it's a little more consistent all the way around. So it seems like they're going on the Game Boy Advance, or PlayStation 1 in this case, as a basis, but it's not exact. And I'll also note the cape being bluish purple with the gold on the elbows and wrists. Looks like his Dissidia design, so nice touch there. You can also distinctly tell here now that the sprites are based much more on the original NES, particularly the Thief with his brown clothing looks nothing like the Thief in other versions. The Red Mage and the Warrior have brown hair instead of red, like they did originally, and that is taken from, ironically, their artwork for the Game Boy Advance version, the Dawn of Souls manual artwork. So that's neat that we're having new sprites more faithful to the original NES versions. Moving on to Final Fantasy II, we have the fight with the boss in the Ice Cavern, I believe the dungeon name is. And this is where you can see that this is definitely a new sprite. This turtle sprite is based much more on the original NES sprite that looks nothing like the Game Boy Advance or PlayStation 1 sprites. So once again, aside from the party sprites, new sprite artwork. And then we have the confrontation with the behemoth here. And again, it looks similar to the Game Boy Advance, but the behemoth obviously has completely new sprite artwork. Here it looks almost exactly like it did in the original NES version, once again being more faithful, and it'll probably look a lot like this in battle too. You can also see here one of the problems of making these games widescreen, in that you can see other rooms of the Colosseum off-screen. There's some dungeons in these games where that could pose a problem, especially on games where all the rooms are contained on one separate map. If you go widescreen now, you may be able to see those other rooms, which are supposed to be completely different parts of the dungeons. It isn't a problem here because this is the same building, it's just a different room on the same floor, but there are some dungeons where that could be a problem. I'm assuming they'll take that into account because this is very clearly noticeable, but just a thing to keep in mind. Moving on to Final Fantasy III, not really much point comparing it to the original NES. We have the scene of Desh about to sacrifice himself. We have the airship flight, but there is a little detail I noticed there, and that's the castle in the background, which is definitely 3D. So it makes me wonder if they're going to go with a map system like Final Fantasy VI, where they have 3D models on the world map that's otherwise 2D, which it looks good here. I don't know if the Final Fantasy VI will still keep that with how you can fly in Mode 7 there, but here it looks pretty good, so that's neat. And the final note is we have a screenshot of battle with the Onion Knights, and a neat little touch is that the lower one is a little bit of a pinkish hue. In the original NES, the first and fourth Onion Knights were both red in battle, but on the field, the fourth one was pinkish purple. So that's reflected in battle now properly, now that they don't have to worry about palette restrictions, so nice little touch to detail there. Moving on to Final Fantasy IV, Cecil is about to confront Yong when he's been brainwashed into serving Baron. And there's actually a lot of neat little details here. You can see the windows have light shining through them now. The furniture has better shadows. You could kind of see shadows before, but they're much more distinct and they're cast at an angle now. There's an entirely new floor pattern here. So just nice attention to details. Now in the fight with Yong, we can see once again there is new sprite work here. And you can tell that because Palom and Poem have the stripes on their outfits. They didn't have the stripes in the previous Game Boy Advance or the Super NES release. They only had the stripes in the mobile port, and these are definitely not the same as the mobile sprites. And speaking of new sprite work, here we have the scene of Tella, Cecil, and Rydia around the campfire, and they certainly have new field sprites. If you look at the old field sprites, you can see that they look completely different. These are from the Game Boy Advance version, which were just basically slightly higher quality versions of the Super NES ones. What I particularly like about these new ones is that there's a lot of little details on their outfits that better match their battle sprites. Teller, his glasses are blue, he has the gold trim on his robes. Whittier has the little yellow cape or sash on her outfit. Cecil has the yellow eyes on his helmet. So I really like that shows attention to the art detail and the art direction and consistency in the design. And I'm happy to see that in Final Fantasy IV, because while the PSP port looked great, it bugged me that Cecil looked totally different between Battle, his portrait, and his field sprite. So I like seeing this consistency. Moving on to Final Fantasy V, we have a screenshot of the fight with the Archioavis. And this is interesting here because Ferris, that seems to be the dancer outfit, except it looks completely different from before. Well, not 100% different, but it's much more distinct. Now I think that's the dancer class because it doesn't resemble any other job Ferris has. The only other job she has with some sort of veil around her is the sorcerer, or the mystic knight. And that's definitely not the sorcerer/mystic knight because they have, like, the turban and the cape too. So that's interesting. And then we have the screenshot of Kryle's introduction, where she arrives to help save the party from the possessed King Tycoon. And this screenshot is one of the most interesting in the entire batch, and I'm going to tell you why in just a sec, because finally, last and best is Final Fantasy VI, and I love how these look. Now at the opening scene in the cliffs, you can see Nosh below. The battle background is wider, it has better depth to it, you can see a lot more details to it. The enemies, both here and in Final Fantasy V, they seem to be exactly copied from the Game Boy Advance or Super NES versions, which I don't mind. If those sprites still work, I don't mind them reusing them at all, they still look great here. And I'll also say here, I don't mind the new sprites, especially with the soldiers, Biggs and Wedge. You can barely even tell that they're different, but they look good. There's much more consistent art style here than we got in the mobile version. These sprites look like they fit. A little too bright, but, that's nitpicking, that's me personally. What does look a little off to me is this scene of Terra and Nosh. And the reason it looks off is because it looks a little stretched vertically, which is curious. Final Fantasy VI is odd from the other 5 games in the series in that it uses the same sprites on the overworld as it does in battle, so its sprites are taller than the others. So maybe that's why it looks a little off. Maybe they didn't quite nail that down yet. The thing I did notice before is that we didn't see Final Fantasy VI in the reveal trailer, and we're only seeing the intro now. So it makes me wonder if these games, even if they are going to start releasing next month apparently, maybe Final Fantasy VI is the last one they've done, since it has a different visual style, and it's probably the last one they'll release if they're releasing them in numerical order. So maybe the final version will look a little different, and it's just a little wonky here. We'll see. Now, the details I noticed that really make me question what these remakes are going to be. Take a look at the screenshots for Final Fantasy 2, 4, 5, and 6, and especially the battle screenshots. You'll notice that they have the MP displayed in the heads-up display now. What's concerning, well, look at the Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 3 screenshots. They don't display MP in the bottom window. And that's concerning because the Game Boy Advance and PSP versions of Final Fantasy 1 did use MP. The original NES release used the same magic charge system as Final Fantasy 3 did, where each tier of spell has its own amount of charges, and using a spell of that tier consumes 1 charge. The Game Boy Advance version changed FF1 to use a more traditional MP system. So if they're reverting their spellcasting system, that really makes me question what else they might do. Because the Game Boy Advance version of Final Fantasy 1 had a lot of quality of life improvements. In the original NES version, there weren't enemy item drops. There weren't Phoenix Downs. If someone died and the white mage couldn't revive them, you had to backtrack to a town with a church or a chapel to get them revived. So, I don't know what other gameplay changes they may revert back to, and particularly, what does this mean for the bonus content? Because if they're going to revert the MP system and possibly other gameplay changes, are they still going to keep the new bonus dungeons? changing the MP system and other quality of life changes, they made some areas of Final Fantasy I harder by giving the bosses more HP. So if you're going to revert those gameplay changes, you're going to have to rebalance the new content too, which they could do. It just does raise the question, if they're going to revert to the original spellcasting system, how faithful are these going to be to the originals? Are they going to leave out the bonus content and just have the original games? And I want to say I don't think they will do that, because with other ports being available that do have the bonus content, it raises the question, well, why would you play these over the earlier ports? And I'll also make a case quickly. I do understand why they're not just porting the Game Boy Advance versions, because honestly, I wouldn't want them to. In hindsight, the Game Boy Advance ports of Final Fantasy IV, 5, and 6 weren't awesome. They had a lot of slowdown at times, especially when animating spells, and Final Fantasy VI's airship was painfully laggy. And there was also awful sound quality. It was particularly noticeable in Final Fantasy VI, but even Final Fantasy IV, it sounds like crap compared to the Super NES version. So the sound quality was worse, there was lag, and I think even the mobile ports of Final Fantasy V and VI have the same lag. I haven't played them, but I look at gameplay footage of the airship flying in the mobile port, I'm seeing the same slowdown. It's nowhere near as smooth or as fast as on the Super NES. So just straight porting the Game Boy Advance ports out, I wouldn't want them to do that, because there were obviously technical limitations at hand with the Game Boy Advance ports, and it seems that Final Fantasy V and VI could not completely overcome them if they still have the lag when flying the airship, for instance. So yes, that's a very minor but very revealing detail in the Final Fantasy I and Final Fantasy III screen caps. But it's not all bad. There is another detail that is even more interesting, in my opinion, than just the MP in Final Fantasy I, and that is the Final Fantasy V screen cap of Kryle's introduction. Now, why is that interesting? The question mark. This is the scene of Kryle's introduction in the Game Boy Advance port, and I'm only showing part of the scene here, I can't show the whole thing, but I did watch the whole thing. That question mark does not seem to be there. Which says to me, they've changed this scene. They added that speech bubble there. And I know that's such a minor detail to obsess over, but they changed the scene. So that makes my head spin, because if they're going to make a little minute change like that, they may make other changes. And what it really boils down to, in tandem with the Final Fantasy I screenshot and the MP, these aren't going to be direct one-to-one recreations of previous ports with a different graphical style. These are new remasters. They've changed the gameplay from Final Fantasy I from the Game Boy Advance port. They've changed this scene in Final Fantasy V. Who knows what else they'll change? We may be getting new translations with these remasters, which makes sense. They're going to have to retranslate Final Fantasy III anyway. They can't just copy the DS script, because the DS script had new content that wasn't in the original due to the fact that they had named characters instead of just the Onion Kids. We may have entirely new translations, we may have changes to cutscenes, we may have changes to the bonus dungeons, we may not have bonus dungeons, or possibly we may have new bonus content. Who can say? So there's a lot of unknowns here with what these remasters are going to be compared to previous ports. The gameplay might be different, the cutscenes and scripts might be different, they may or may not have old or new bonus content. I don't know, but I am very eager to find out. I was waiting for new screenshots like these that I could analyze and pick apart like this, and they gave me exactly what I wanted, and I don't know what to think about these anymore. Pixel Remaster is definitely a mystery, and I am enjoying solving it, and I hope you enjoyed solving it too. Thank you for sitting through this video. Please like and subscribe and share it around if you enjoyed it, and I will definitely bring you more Pixel Remaster analysis and news as it develops.